السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أهلا وسهلا فيكم. بنرحب بضيف أكاديمية فلسطين الطالب دكتوراه فادي الجلجولي، اللي هو طالب دكتوراه في جسر العلوم ألماني فلسطيني، والباحث في معهد الطاقة والمناخ في معهد ويلش للأبحاث، وراح يلقي ندوة حول تصميم المواد وثبات بطاريات الليثيوم أيون الصلبة Material Design and Stability of All-Solid-state Lithium Ion Batteries. أهلا وسهلا. Welcome, Fadi. You can start.
دكتور احنا شايفينك انت مش شايفين يعني. Thank you very much, Dr. Ayman, for your introduction. My name is Fadi Al-Jaljouli. I am a PhD student in the Forschungszentrum Jülich, especially in the Institute of Energy and Climate Research for the Material Synthesis and Processing IK1. This project is under supervision of Dr. Robert Mücke and Professor Olivier Giillon from the same department. We know that all lithium-ion batteries are a part or major part of our recent life. Now, in order to have the requirements of the energy carriers is to be easy to use, to be reliable, to have a sufficient energy capacity, and to be friendly to the environment, and finally, which is the most important thing, to be safe, to have a high power, high energy, lower cost, and longer life. We either develop the recent batteries or we find new batteries. In our research, we are going to try to develop the recent batteries in order to have these requirements. Now, this is the schematic of a conventional lithium-ion batteries. In this case, we have the cathode, which consists of the lithium cobalt oxide, for short LCO. Actually, it has a layered structure. We are going to talk about this later. And we have the anode, which consists of the graphite, and its functions is only to store ions in it during the cycling, of course. We have also the electrolyte, which prevent the electronic conductivity or the transportation of the ion of the electrons from the cathode to the anode, but allow the ions to move from the cathode to the anode through or during the delithiation of the cathode. We have also the current collector, which is aluminum in the cathode, and the current collector, which is copper on the anode. Now, sometimes in the lithium, in the liquid or gel lithium ion batteries, the electrolyte may evaporate, and then there's a contact between the electrodes between the cathode and the anode, and this will cause an explosion in the battery. And this is the cases we have, for example, in some cars or in some mobiles. Now, this is why we draw that or the mixed cathode of all-solid-state lithium-ion batteries draw our attention. In this case, we have an active materials, which is the lithium cobalt oxide, which is in red, and LLZO, which is lithium lanthanum zirconium oxide, as electrolyte or solid electrolyte, but it should be utilized, or it should be embedded in the mixed cathode in order to have ionic conductivity from the cathode through to the anode through the electrolyte. Now, this is the structure of the lithium cobalt oxide, which have layered structures, of course, of the cobalt oxide plates or layered, and the lithium is between them actually. And this is facilitate the mass transportation between of the particles or of the ions and the electrons through the cathodes, for example. Now, but we have a case here. We are talking about volume expansion in the lithium cobalt oxide. Actually, in A and B direction, or we can say XY direction, there is a contradiction, or sorry, there's a decreasing in the on the space or on the dimension of the A and B when we delithiate the lithium cobalt oxide. But we also have an expansion in the C direction, which means that we have a volume expansion in the LCO when we discharge or when we delithiate the lithium cobalt oxide during cycling. And this is why we say that the delithiation of LCO causes a volume change in the material. Now, our summary or our assumption that due to the change of the lithium ion concentration, we have a lattice change in the lithium cobalt oxide. This causes a volume expansion of the lithium cobalt oxide, and this generates stress. And also there will be, as a result of this stress, there is a fracture and degradation of the lithium cobalt oxide. And this is a TIM image, for example, where we can see the cracks in the cobalt oxide, lithium cobalt oxide, sorry. So we can say that changing the microstructure could be a solution to our to reduce the stress. Now, our motivation here, since storage material expand during lithiation or delithiation, that's mean because we are talking about solid-state batteries, there is no free space between solid phases in the composite electrodes, and that means that strains are constrained by neighboring particles. This will cause a high stress, which, and as a result of this, there is a possibility of mechanical degradation during cycling, for example, cracking. Our aim for research is to minimize the stress in ceramic-based all-solid-state lithium-ion batteries while maintaining the electronic and ionic conductivity and the capacity. And moreover, we are going to investigate the microstructural governing factors of mechanical stresses and conductivities. This is in order to regenerate the experimental microstructure. First, we took FIB, focused ion beam, SEM images of the experimental microstructure. Then we imported them to the software called Giillon. So after image processing, binarization, and a 3D reconstruction, this is the structure we have of the experimental microstructure. It's just computer design. So we characterize it, and we have the volume fraction values of LCO, LLZO, the relative density, which is another way to represent the porosity in the system, and the solid volume fraction of LCO. Keep in mind, please, that relative density is calculated by 100 minus the volume fraction of the pores, and the solid volume fraction of LCO is a division of the volume fraction of LCO to the relative density multiplied by 100%. Now, in order to generate the microstructure, first we just investigated the experimental microstructure, and if we just take one part, for example, and zoom it in, we have, for example, the lithium cobalt oxide, which are darks. We have flat structures, and we have sometimes some spherical parts, which means that LCO could be considered as hexagonal particles, and these are the spherical particles. But for LLZO, which are the bright parts, for example, we have spherical parts only, and that's why we predicted that we have this volume fraction and dimensions of the LLZO spheres in the system. The pores are black here in the system. So these are the initial grain shapes and size and volume fraction of the particles we use in the system. Now, the first step is to use a Python script in order to originate the microstructure. And we used first the piling process, and in piling process, actually, we use the initial grain size of LCO and LLZO and the solid volume fraction of LCO. After that, we did a distribution step, which is just rearrange of the particles inside the system to ensure that we have a homogeneous distribution in the system. Sometimes we have an aggregation in the upper and lower limits, especially because we are doing a piling from the z-axis, actually positive z-axis. So we do the cropping from the positive and negative z-axis. And after that, we do centering with the initial relative density. Sometimes we need to crop it more again to ensure that we have a representative microstructure. Now, because we have increasing of the grain sizes through or during the centering, we should first measure the actual solid volume fraction of LCO and the actual relative density, and check how far the actual one with the target one, with both the relative density and the solid volume fraction of LCO. If the difference is small enough, then the procedure will stop. Otherwise, the loop is going to readjust the solid volume, the input values of the solid volume fraction of LCO and the relative density, and restart the process all over again. And this is the result of the modeled structure of the experimental structure. The values of the volume fraction of LCO, volume fraction of LLZO, relative density, and the solid volume fraction of LCO are matching or almost matching with the experimental one. The LCO and LLZO diameter were 2 micrometer and 1.41 micrometer respectively. In order to validate the reduced microstructure, we started with the average inner diameter, and in this case, we are talking about the grain size of LCO and LLZO. For LCO, the average inner diameter of the reduced microstructure was slightly higher, but it's were close enough with the experimental one, but that was not the case with LLZO. In the experimental and the reproduced structure, LCO or the majority of LLZO or average inner diameter of LLZO were lower than the experimental or the average inner diameter of the experimental one. And this is actually affecting the relative conductivity, and relative conductivity calculated by conductivity of the phases in the phases framework. And for example, LCO and LLZO divided on the bulk conductivity. And this represents the functionality of the mixed cathode. We see here, because of that, there's no such a difference between the average inner diameter between experimental and the reproduced and the experimental microstructure. So the relative conductivity of LCO were so close and valid. I mean, they are matching enough. But that was not the case for the relative conductivity of LZO, for example. And this related, or because there's a difference between an average, the average inner diameter of LLZO in the reproduced one. It was lower for the average inner diameter of the reproduced one were lower than the experimental one, and this is why it's also the relative conductivity of LLZO in the reproduced structure is lower than the experimental one. Now, another important factor is the chord length, and chord length is affected by two factors. First, how much homogeneity in the structure we have, and it's also affected by the orientation of the particles. For example, we can see here that chord length of LCO were lower than in the experimental one, were slightly lower than the experimental one, which means that we have in the experimental one we have more flat particles. For LZO, it was not affected much because we used spherical particles. For the chord length of pores, we can see almost matching in the pattern between the chord length of pores with the chord length of LCO, which means that the chord length of LCO or the LCO particles, the shape, the orientation actually, and the distribution is affecting the chord length of pores, the shape and the orientation too. The volume specific interface area between LCO and LZO LCO to pore and LLZO to pore were almost matching between the experimental and the reproduced structure. It is very important for us because we have a hypothesis up to now that this is the factor that may affect the stress inside the system. Now, for our work procedure is to vary each time one parameter only while keeping the other parameter fixed. For example, we started with variation of the solid volume fraction of LCO while keeping the other parameters, the relative density, the grain size of LCO, grain size of LLZO fixed. And these are just an example of these such a variation. Also, we varied the relative density and only while keeping the solid volume fraction of LCO, the grain size of LCO, and the grain size of LZO fixed. We have also varied the grain size of LCO while keep the solid volume fraction of LCO and relative density and the grain size of LZO fixed. And finally, this is the variation of grain size of LZO while keeping the grain size of LCO, relative density, and the solid volume fraction of LCO fixed. Our assumption is we are going to calculate the total stress, and the total stress or the procedure we have here is we have cooling down after sintering. For example, we moved from 950 degrees Celsius to room temperature 20 degrees Celsius, and this is why we call it thermal stress, and we use the thermal analogy to calculate the stress in this case. And these are the strains or the thermal strains of LCO, the thermal strains of LLZO, and these values are being calculated by our partner in the department. The second step is the delithiation, and in this case we are talking about half delithiation, which means half lithium concentration in the system. So we moved from lithium cobalt oxide to the half of the lithium cobalt oxide, half of the lithium in the lithium cobalt oxide, and we call it actually the chemical or the delithiation strain. And these values of the strains in LCO, strains of the lithiation strains of chemical strains of LCO, the chemical strains of LLZO, which equal to 0 because we have no volume expansion or no change in strains in LLZO. And we got this from the literature too. Now, for the Chemo-Thermal, it's summation. The strains are the summation of the lithium strain with the thermal strain, and these are the Chemo-Thermal strain of LCO, which are only the summation between the thermal strain of LCO with the delithiation or chemical strain of LCO, and these are the Chemo-Thermal strain of LLZO, which is only the summation between strain or lithium strain of LCO LLZO with the lithium or delithiation or chemical strain of LLZO. Because we have anisotropic behavior of LCO, this is the compliance matrix of the system of the LCO, and we have also the elastic modulus of LLZO, the Poisson ratio of LLZO. We use a symmetric boundary condition to do this simulation. For the thermal stress, we have thermal mismatch between LCO and LLZO, which creates strains while cooling down after sintering. In fact, because we are talking about cooling down, then the LCO and LLZO are shrinking, but they are thermal mismatch, as we say. That's why we have a tensile stress on LCO, but compressive stress on LLZO. And when we increase the solid volume fraction of LCO, the stress on LLZO is increasing actually, but the stress on LLZO is decreasing. And we are going to talk about this but later on. Now, also varying the porosity or the relative density in the system, when we increase the relative density, which means decreasing the porosity, we have an increasing on the stress on LCO and LZO. But there is no change on the grain size. There is no change in stress after or due to the variation of grain size of LCO or LZO. For the chemical stress, for example, this is the same procedure, but in another way, because we are talking about LCO. LCO here is expanding, it's not shrinking anymore. That's why we have compressive stress on LCO, but tensile stress on LLZO. And here, when we increase the solid volume fraction of LCO, the stress on LCO decreased, but for LLZO, the stress will increase. Same behavior when we have increasing of the solid volume fraction. So both stresses on LCO and LLZO are increasing too. Again, there is no variation or no change on stress when we vary the grain size of LCO and LLZO. For the chemo-thermal stress, which are the summation, let's understand what's happening here. When we have, for example, full lithium cobalt oxide in the system, which means that we have zero LLZO. Then we have bulk LLCO, and LCO will expand freely without any constraints in the system. That means the stress on LCO will be zero. But when we start to have when we start to decrease the solid volume fraction of LCO, that means we have a presence of LLZO in the system. Once we have this presence, that means we have a resistivity. When we have this resistivity, we start to have a stress on LCO in the system. And that's why we have a stress on LCO once we start to decrease the solid volume fraction of LCO. The way around with decreasing, or when we have zero solid volume fraction of LCO, if we have zero solid volume fraction of LCO, that means there is no solid volume fraction, or there is no LCO in the system, no expansion. That means we have only LLZO, which means that there will be zero stress on LZO. But when we start to have a presence of LCO in the system, that means the expansion will start to occur, which in return will apply stress on LLZO. That's why the stress will start to increase. Now, the effect of higher coordination number and decrease the available of pore space to allow the stress, to allow the LCO to expand freely is what we see here when we increase the relative density, which means increasing the amount of available pores to in the system. That means the stress and LCO and LLZO will start to increase too. But again, we have no effect on stress when we vary the grain size of LCO and LLZO. Now, please keep in mind that the error bars represent the width of stress distribution, which is called standard deviation, of course. And we can see here, for example, that the total stress of LCO and LLZO is equal to the difference between thermal and chemothermal stress. But what about the conductivity? When we increase, for example, when we increase the solid volume fraction of LCO, that means we are decreasing the population of LLZO. That's why we have a decreasing on its relative ionic conductivity. But since we are increasing the population of LCO, that means it will increase its electronic conductivity. But that was not the case actually when we increase the relative density. Actually, it's enhancing the conductivity of LCO, of course, because they are compressed together. There are no less pores, which means this insulating. But since we have 2-to-1 ratio between LCO to LLZO, this means that we have a small population or contents of LZO in the system. That's why it will not affect, it didn't affect the stress, the conductivity of LZO. So basically we can say that the conductivity is affected by the volume fraction, or the volume fraction of the content in the system. But again, the grain size, the grain size of LCO and LZO did not change or vary or affect the conductivity either for LCO or LLZO. Now, we spoke about our hypothesis, which is the interface area between LCO and LLZO previously. But for example, this is a sketch of the modeled mixed cathode, and please, we will take this area as an example. So the blue area is an area, interface area between LCO and LLZO. The yellow area is the area between the interface area between LLZO and pores, while the black one is the interface area between LCO and pores. Now, we will introduce this factor which is called KLCO as a ratio of the surface area between LCO and LLZO and the total surface area of LCO. And this calculated by dividing the area, the blue area between LCO and LLZO to the total area, which is the blue one between LCO and LLZO, and the black one, which is between LCO and pores. While KLLZO is a ratio of a surface area of LCO to LLZO and the total surface area of LLZO, which means here we are dividing the blue area, the interface area between LCO and LLZO, to the total area, which means the blue area between LCO and LLZO, and now the yellow one, which is between LLZO to pores. Now, this is why when we for example plot the KLCO to the stress in KLLZO, for example, to the stress in LLZO, we saw that there is a same pattern while we varying the solid volume fraction of LCO and the solid volume and the relative density, but that was not the case for varying the grain size. While when we plotted the KLCO to the stress in LCO, we also had the same pattern for an for the solid volume fraction variation and the relative density, but again was not the case for varying the grain size. So what we can say here that we need some modification to this factor in order to, because of the no effect here, or no, there's no pattern for the variation of the grain size, for example. So KLCO and LLZO could be considered as a potential governing factor of the stress in LCO and LLZO respectively. While for the conductivity, we spoke later or previously that the conductivity is affected by the population or on the contents of the material or material in the system. That's why when we plot the volume fraction of LCO versus the conductivity of LCO, for example, we saw the same pattern while varying the solid volume fraction of LCO, varying the relative density or the grain size, and that was the same behavior when we plotted the VLZO to the relative ionic conductivity of LLZO. We saw the same pattern for each variation, which means that volume fraction of LCO and volume fraction of LLZO is the governing factor of the relative conductivity of LCO and LLZO respectively. Well, and this is very important because this is the first time ever we found or someone calculate the governing factor of the such mechanical properties and electronic and ionic conductivities. This is very important here. So the summary to my talk here, the stress in LCO and LLZO and their conductivities are literally linearly increasing with the solid volume fraction of LCO values. The stress in LCO and LLZO and their conductivities are progressively varied with the relative density values. Varying the grain size of LCO and LLZO had no effect neither on their stresses nor on their conductivities. Relative density cannot be used as a stress reduction because of LLZO conductivity. Chemical stresses of LCO and LLZO is 2 times higher than the thermal stress with the opposite sign. The combined thermal plus chemical stress values are approximately half of the deletion stress. KLCO and KLZO could be considered as a potential governing factor of stresses in LCO and LZO respectively. And finally, volume fraction of LCO, volume fraction of LLZO could be considered as a governing factor of electronic and ionic conductivity respectively. To this point, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am open for questions.
Thank you very much, Fadi. Good luck. Thanks.